The woods were still as Jack finished pitching the tent under the growing dusk. The tall pines stood sentinel, their dark silhouettes sharp against the soft glow of the setting sun. Jack exhaled, his breath misting in the cool air. It had been years since he'd taken a trip like this. Just him, the wilderness, and now his 23-year-old stepson Leo. "Looks like we're all set," Jack said, brushing his hands off on his jeans. His voice carried the kind of casual authority that had once commanded respect in his younger years. Now, though, it faltered when Leo met his gaze. Leo, crouched by the campfire he was building, smirked. "Not bad for an old man," he teased, striking a match. Jack chuckled despite himself, but the playful barb lingered. He wasn't blind to what the years had taken from him. Lines on his face, a heaviness in his step. But Leo was a reminder of everything he wasn't anymore. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a confidence that seemed effortless, Leo carried himself like someone who knew the world was his for the taking. The flames crackled to life, casting flickering shadows across Leo's sharp jawline and golden brown hair. Jack turned away, busying himself with their gear to mask the unease bubbling under his skin. This trip wasn't just about teaching Leo how to hunt. Jack had suggested it in part to escape his crumbling marriage. The fights with his wife had become a nightly ritual, her accusations of his emotional distance piercing sharper than the arrows in his quiver. He thought he could use the trip to clear his head, maybe bond with Leo in a way he hadn't before. But now, alone with his stepson in the isolating quiet of the wilderness, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. "You okay over there?" Leo's voice broke through Jack's thoughts. "Yeah," Jack replied, shaking himself. "Just thinking about tomorrow. Early start." Leo nodded, his grin softening. "Thanks for inviting me out here. I didn't think you'd ever want to do something like this with me." Jack frowned. "Why wouldn't I?" Leo shrugged, tossing a stick into the fire. "I don't know. You've always been distant. Thought maybe you didn't like me all that much." The words hit Jack harder than they should have. He walked over and sat down across from Leo, the firelight between them flickering like an unspoken truth. "It's not that," Jack said after a pause. "You're not a kid anymore. Guess I wasn't sure if you'd even want to hang out with someone like me." "Someone like you?" Leo arched a brow, a teasing edge returning to his tone. "You know, old, boring." Jack forced a laugh, but Leo didn't smile. "I don't think you're boring," Leo said quietly, his eyes steady on Jack's. The moment hung between them, heavier than the cool night air. Jack shifted, unsure of what to say, and instead looked toward the trees, the shadows deepening as the firelight danced. "You're not boring either," Jack said finally, his voice low, almost reluctant. He felt Leo's gaze linger on him, but he didn't dare look back. Later, when they crawled into the tent, the space felt smaller than Jack remembered. They lay in their sleeping bags, mere inches apart, the quiet punctuated by the occasional crackle of the dying fire outside. "Good night," Jack said, his voice raspier than he intended. "Night," Leo replied. There was something in his tone, soft, warm, almost inviting, that made Jack's stomach tighten. As the forest settled into its nocturnal rhythm, Jack stared at the canvas roof of the tent, his thoughts a tangled mess. The trip had only just begun, and already, it felt like the air between them was charged with something unspoken, something neither of them was ready to name. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, but inside the tent, the tension was suffocating. The fire crackled low as night claimed the forest, the golden glow casting shifting shadows across their small campsite. Jack sat on a log, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of lukewarm coffee, his eyes flickering between the fire and Leo. The silence between them was heavy, not awkward, but weighted with an unspoken tension that neither seemed willing to name. Leo sat cross-legged on the ground, poking at the embers with a stick. The light played over his face, accentuating the sharp angles of his jaw and the faint curve of his lips. Jack found himself studying the younger man longer than he should have, the realization leaving an uncomfortable warmth in his chest. "You've been quiet," Leo said, breaking the silence. He looked up, his eyes catching Jack's with a steady intensity. "Just thinking," Jack replied, his voice gruff as he turned his gaze back to the fire. "About?" Jack hesitated. "Life, I guess. Things I've messed up." Leo frowned, tossing the stick into the fire. You don't seem like the type to make many mistakes. Jack laughed dryly, the sound devoid of humor. You'd be surprised. Leo leaned back on his elbows, his posture relaxed, but his expression thoughtful. Is it about Mom? The question hung in the air like smoke, curling into the space between them. Jack exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. Yeah, he admitted. It's been hard lately. Feels like we're more strangers than partners. Leo sat up, his brows knitting together. I've noticed. She doesn't talk about you much anymore. Jack winced at the bluntness, but didn't argue. He looked at Leo, surprised to find a softness in his expression that he hadn't expected. You deserve better, Jack, Leo said quietly. Jack blinked. It was the first time Leo had called him by his name instead of the usual Jack or you. The familiarity in it sent a ripple through him, stirring something he couldn't quite define. Thanks, Jack said, his voice low. Leo shifted closer, closing the small gap between them. You know, you don't have to carry all of this by yourself. You're not as alone as you think. The words were simple, but they landed with surprising force. Jack looked at Leo, his defenses cracking under the younger man's unwavering gaze. There was something magnetic about Leo, something that pulled at Jack in ways that left him off balance. You're a good kid, Jack said, his tone softer now. Leo smirked. I'm not a kid anymore. Jack opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss. The truth of Leo's words hung between them, undeniable. Leo reached for the coffee pot, his hand brushing against Jack's as he poured himself a cup. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through Jack, who pulled his hand back quickly. Sorry, Leo said, his tone light but his eyes sharp, watching Jack's reaction. It's fine, Jack murmured, though his pulse betrayed him, thudding loudly in his ears. The fire burned lower, casting their faces in softer, more intimate light. They sat in silence again, but this time, it felt charged. Jack's mind raced, his thoughts tangled between what was right and what was undeniable. I should turn in, Jack said suddenly, standing up and dusting off his jeans. Leo's eyes followed him, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Sure, I'll be in soon. Jack nodded, retreating into the tent. He lay on his sleeping bag, staring up at the dark fabric above him, his mind replaying every glance, every word, every touch. Minutes later, the tent's zipper buzzed, and Leo slipped inside. The space instantly felt smaller, the air heavier. Leo settled into his sleeping bag with a soft sigh, his movements deliberately slow, as if testing Jack's reaction. Good night, Leo murmured, his voice low and warm. Jack swallowed hard, closing his eyes. Good night. The tent fell into silence, but the charged atmosphere lingered, thick and undeniable. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but inside, something unspoken simmered, waiting for the right moment to surface. The storm hit without warning. Rain pounded the tent like 1,000 drumming fingers, each gust of wind threatening to tear the fragile shelter from its moorings. Jack lay on his back, his breathing shallow, acutely aware of how close Leo was beside him. The shared space, already intimate, now felt suffocating, the scent of rain-soaked earth mingling with the faint trace of Leo's cologne. You awake? Leo's voice broke through the roar of the storm, low and tentative. Jack hesitated, his pulse quickening. Yeah, I can't sleep. Leo shifted, the rustle of nylon and the warmth of his body, stirring the tension Jack had tried so hard to ignore. It's just a storm, Jack said, his voice rough. It'll pass. Leo laughed softly, the sound strangely comforting. That's not what's keeping me up. Jack turned his head, meeting Leo's gaze in the dim light of the tent. His face was close, too close, the flicker of vulnerability in his eyes sending a jolt through Jack's chest. What is it then? Jack asked, his voice barely audible over the rain. For a moment, Leo said nothing. Then, with a boldness that made Jack's breath hitch, he whispered, You? The word hung in the air, heavy and electric. Jack's throat tightened as he struggled to process what he'd just heard. Leo, I know what you're going to say, Leo interrupted, his voice steady now, though his eyes betrayed a hint of nervousness. But I need to say this. I need you to know. Jack pushed himself onto one elbow, his mind racing. Leo, this isn't, right? Appropriate. Leo cut him off again, his tone sharper. I've been telling myself that too. But you can't tell me you don't feel it. This thing between us. Jack's mouth went dry. The storm outside seemed to fade, the world narrowing to the charged space between them. He wanted to deny it, to shut this down before it went any further, but the truth pressed against him, relentless and undeniable. This isn't fair to either of us, Jack said finally, his voice low and strained. Leo leaned closer, his hand brushing against Jack's arm. The touch was light, hesitant, but it sent a shiver through Jack's body. What's fair? Leo murmured, ignoring what's real just because it doesn't fit into some box. Jack stared at him, the weight of Leo's words cutting through his carefully constructed defenses. For so long, he'd told himself that his feelings were fleeting, a byproduct of loneliness and circumstance. But now, with Leo so close, so earnest, the lies he'd told himself crumbled. Leo, you don't understand what you're asking, Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm not asking for anything, Leo replied. I just want to know if you feel it too. Jack's heart pounded as he struggled to find the words. The storm roared outside, matching the chaos inside him. He looked into Leo's eyes, saw the hope and the fear and the undeniable pull that mirrored his own. Yes, Jack admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop it. The space between them disappeared as Leo closed the gap, his lips brushing against Jack's in a kiss that was soft yet charged with everything unsaid. Jack froze, the weight of the moment crashing over him. But then he surrendered, his hand reaching up to cup the back of Leo's neck, pulling him closer. For a few heartbeats, the world fell away. The rain, the wind, the impossible weight of their choices. All of it faded in the warmth of their connection. But as the kiss deepened, Jack pulled back, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. This can't happen, Jack said, his voice trembling. Leo met his gaze, his expression resolute. It already has. Jack turned away, lying back down and staring at the dark ceiling of the tent. His mind raced, torn between what he wanted and what he knew was right. The storm raged on, but inside the tent, the tension was quieter now, no less intense, but laden with the promise of something neither of them could take back. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the forest drenched and silent. Mist clung to the treetops, and droplets fell from the branches in rhythmic drips. Jack stood at the edge of the clearing, his bow in hand, his eyes scanning the dense woods ahead. The world felt heavier than usual, the memory of the previous night pressing down on him, like an invisible weight. Behind him, Leo approached quietly, his footsteps muffled by the damp earth. You didn't wake me, he said, his voice low, carrying none of the lightness it usually held. You needed the rest, Jack replied without turning. Leo stopped a few feet away, the tension between them palpable. You're avoiding me, he said bluntly. Jack sighed, lowering his bow. I'm not avoiding you. I'm trying to think. Think about what? Jack turned to face him, his expression unreadable. About what happens next? About what we've done? Leo crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. What we've done, he echoed, a trace of anger in his voice. You make it sound like a mistake, isn't it? Jack shot back, his voice sharper than he intended. Leo, you're my stepson. This, whatever this is, it shouldn't have happened. Leo flinched but didn't back down. You can't tell me it didn't mean something, that you didn't feel it. Jack ran a hand through his hair, frustration and guilt warring within him. It doesn't matter what I felt. There's a line we crossed, and we can't undo that. But we can stop it from going any further. Leo's expression softened, but his eyes remained intense. You're scared, he said quietly. Of course I'm scared, Jack admitted. This isn't just about us, Leo. This could ruin everything, for both of us. Leo stepped closer, the vulnerability in his gaze catching Jack off guard. What if I don't care about the consequences? What if I'm willing to risk it? Jack's breath caught. The sheer honesty in Leo's words shook him, leaving him standing there, exposed and uncertain. He wanted to believe that they could walk away from this, that they could bury the truth and return to their separate lives. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. I care, Jack said finally, his voice steady but low. I care too much to let you throw your life away on something that can't last. Leo's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Jack thought he might argue. But instead, Leo looked away, his shoulders sagging in defeat. So that's it? We just pretend nothing happened? Jack hesitated. It's for the best. The silence stretched between them, the weight of Jack's words sinking in. Leo nodded slowly, his movements stiff and reluctant. Fine, he said, his voice flat. If that's what you want. It's not about what I want, Jack said softly, but Leo was already walking away, heading back toward the campsite. Jack watched him go, his heart heavy with regret. He wanted to call out, to say something, anything, that would ease the ache in his chest. But he stayed silent, letting the distance between them grow. When Jack returned to the campsite, Leo was packing up their gear, his movements quick and efficient. The younger man's usual ease was gone, replaced by a cold detachment that left Jack feeling hollow. They spent the rest of the morning in near silence, the tension between them a tangible presence. As they loaded the truck and began the long drive home, Jack stole glances at Leo, hoping for some sign of the easy camaraderie they'd shared before. But Leo's gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, his expression unreadable. As the miles passed, Jack's mind raced with what-ifs and unanswered questions. He knew he'd made the right decision, but the ache in his chest told him that right didn't always mean easy or bearable. When they finally reached the driveway, Leo stepped out of the truck without a word, grabbing his bag and heading toward the house. Jack watched him go, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He sat there for a long time, staring at the door Leo had disappeared behind. The trip was over, but the aftermath lingered, a storm of its own, one he wasn't sure they could ever escape.